Well, welcome again to those of you who are joining us for our relationship class. My name is Wendy Lyons Crosstech, and I'm one of our pastors here. And joining me is Kay McCarthy. Kay, will you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I do family law, and so I deal with divorce, and I also get appointed as a guardian ad litem for kids in high conflict cases. And I do conflict coaching for individuals in the business environment, and I also do mediation in business environment for workplace conflicts. So kind of deal with conflict all day, every day. It's pretty much where I am.
Yes, some people like to run from conflict, and Kay's like, I'm right at home with it. So we're really excited to have you here. And as we talk about this topic, this subject, you know, you may find yourself getting a little uncomfortable with, okay, I'm going to be thinking about some of the hard things, but I really think you'll get some really great, practical, helpful tools. So glad that you are here. A few logistical things that I want to share with you. There are name tags. If you don't already have one, in the notebooks that you've received, please sign in. Let us know that you are here. There are two handouts in there. There's one that has writing on front and back. We want to make sure everybody gets one of those. And then the second is just an empty sheet of paper that you can use to take additional notes if while we're having discussions or doing slides, there's something you want to jot down. And then the last are small sorts of slips of paper. And as the last 10 minutes of our time, we'll do some question and answer, but rather than kind of move a microphone around, if you have a question and want to submit it, on either side, there are bowls, and you can drop those off in between anytime that there's a break session. Last thing is, there will be some time for personal reflection and conversation, but also connection around tables. So if you're sitting by yourself, make sure you find a friend. So anyway, so all that kind of being said, I'm going to really actually just turn it over right now because part of one of the things that I recognize is that each and every one of us, as we think about who we are and how we resolve and how we think through conflict, we all have a different way of looking at it. And as we'll talk through, and you'll have a chance to really think about, that can be oftentimes affected by our family and how our family dealt with conflict, or maybe in my case didn't deal with conflict or didn't deal well with it, whatever that might look like. So, but Kay, I'm going to ask you, since you are an expert at this, can you kind of help us think through what are some of the different styles of conflict? How do people interact different and work and process through conflict?
So I think, when you think about conflict, we all have a place that we go when we're angry. Mm-hmm. It's when you're in that fight or flight mode. And other times, we kind of fluctuate between a couple of different ones, and we'll move the slide up. And these aren't, all inclusive. There's different ways of doing it. But over time, this particular model to me speaks a little bit better, because I think all of us kind of fall into some of these categories, and none of these by themselves are inherently bad. Avoiding, if you're going to look at something that is not optimal, that probably falls into the category. Mm-hmm. But avoiding is a very unassertive, uncooperative mode. And I know that sounds funny when you think of uncooperative, but it's uncooperative from the standpoint of you're not solving anything. Right. You're not moving toward any kind of a resolution and address any conflict that you have going on. And so what you'll see with people that avoid, and what's important is to know, number one, what your style is, but also the person you're in conflict with and where they are at that given point. Because what'll happen a lot of times is they'll just kind of politely step aside, or they might withdraw and just stop talking. They might actually, what we see a lot of times is in divorce cases and certainly in the workplace is that's the person that oftentimes just quits, and everybody goes, well, wait a minute, I thought Susie was happy. Mm-hmm. And Susie's never said anything that she's dissatisfied in the workplace. She'll just up and leave. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you see a lot with avoiding. And sometimes avoiding's okay, because if you're in a high conflict, you never try to resolve it right then, avoiding it and walking away, but you have to set a time to come back. Mm-hmm. Accommodating is a little bit further out on the continuum. It's unassertive, but it's more cooperative. But what happens is, if you're accommodating, you're neglecting what you need in that conflict. And that may be okay in the short run or in a given situation, but what happens is, if you're constantly being accommodating, resentment builds up. As you can imagine, you get angry, and you at some point start feeling like, yeah, I'm not getting anything out of this relationship. The person that does this, you'll see at work or in family gatherings, they're the one that's always smoothing everything over. It's like, it's okay, it'll be fine. And it probably will be, but you're not ending up dealing with any of the underlying issues. Competing, I struggle with this one. I have huge issues with competition. And, my husband was also an attorney, so you can imagine the arguments that we had in our house. There was a lot of objection, asked and answered, hearsay. I struggle with the competition piece. But competition is when you kick into power mode and you kick into, I'm going to win regardless of what you have to lose to get there. That's okay if you're buying a car and you don't care about an ongoing relationship with your salesperson. It's probably not even okay there from a Christian perspective. But it's not okay with relationships that you care about or you want to maintain. Compromising, that's in the middle of the scale because that's what we end up doing about 90% of the time for most of us. And compromising looks like, well, you want this and I want this, let's just split it down the middle. And while that's certainly a good option and everybody gets something about what they want, my encouragement to you is try to work toward collaborating. Because collaborating is where you're getting a little bit beyond what somebody's stated position is, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is it they really need? Or what is it that I really need out of this? And it gives you a much deeper understanding of that person and where the conflict comes from. And it makes the solutions that you come up with more long-lasting. Because if people are part of a good solution that doesn't necessarily look like just splitting it down the middle, they'll abide by it a lot more. One of the things I always say, and some of you have been in my conflicts class, and so some of this is going to be a little bit repetitive for you, but my encouragement to you is, talk amongst yourselves at the tables, because I don't purport to be an expert. I mean, you may have some phenomenal ways that you've dealt with conflict that would be helpful to the group, and certainly encourage you to share those. But I also want to make sure if you're in a domestic violence situation or a situation where there's addiction involved, just be cautious about some of these principles and make sure you're consulting with Wendy or some of our pastors or a therapist, because some of these things don't apply, when you're talking about, confronting somebody and talking about conflict. So,
yeah, great. Thank you. Well, one of the things that I find myself sort of like the avoiding sometimes. I just want to be really nice and want everybody to like me. But one of the things that I know I've noticed in myself is that if I avoid conflict, I'm not giving someone an opportunity to draw near to them. Because when conflict, we in our premarital class will say this, conflict is an opportunity for deeper connection in disguise, which doesn't necessarily sound like it always is the case, but if you can have an open and honest conversation with someone and say, this is how I feel, you have an opportunity to draw nearer to them. If it's your neighbor and your neighbor's doing something that is frustrating you and just driving you crazy, how might you, instead of being passive-aggressive or never say anything, have an open conversation, and then that will allow you to be in just honestly a better relationship with one another. So I want to share a few scripture passages as we think about conflict, and again, recognizing that they're not all bad at any particular time, but just helping us to think about it. So sometimes folks talk about, I sort of put these two together because I like the idea of talking about it or thinking about it. Sometimes folks talk about don't go to bed angry or sleep on it. So those are the two different ways that we think about this. So the first is a passage from Ephesians. Be angry without sinning, but do not let the sun go down on your anger. Now, for some folks, this is important because they can't sleep. If there's something that is upsetting them, they cannot physically move forward until they've had a discussion about it. And so there are times when you say, this really needs to be addressed right now, or I'm not going to be at peace. But on the other side of the coin, from Proverbs, hot tempers cause arguments, but patience brings peace. Have you ever, I feel like I love my husband, but it seems like the worst possible times are the moments that we get in arguments. It's usually because we're stressed. We're on our way to some big event. We've got something going on. and it's not the right time to have a conversation about it. For multiple reasons. Number one, our emotions are flared, and I may be really likely to say something I will regret. Or number two, we just don't have the time to actually have the conversation. And so in those instances, saying, we're just gonna have to put a pin in this and sort of like push it off to the side, and we'll deal with it later. Now, not avoiding it and not coming back to it. Now, that's not what I'm saying, but saying, let's give ourselves some time, a little bit of patience, a step back, and then allow us to move forward. The next two are about kindness and forgiveness. So kindness from Colossians, therefore, as God's chosen ones, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion and kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And I was just telling Kay about this book that's called Conflict Without Casualties. It is a field guide for leading with compassionate accountability. So there are a few principles that I'm pulling from here, but one of the things that I really love that they talk about is this idea of being compassionate. And we don't always think about conflict and compassion going in together, but they're both really important. So as one of the things that Kay was talking about is this idea of being competitive and trying to win. That's like us going together and saying we're against each other, but being compassionate means that we're working together and that we are trying to do something together. Compassion literally means to feel the pain of somebody else. And so when you are trying to resolve compassionately conflict, what you're saying is, I want to understand where it is that you're coming from, and I want you to understand where I'm coming from, and you're placing the relationship above winning. So when you think about it in that capacity, and just being kind, just all around being kind so that you can preserve the relationship. The second piece is forgiveness. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And I'm going to say this, but we're not going to have time to really work through what that looks like. Forgiveness is an entire, not just a one class, it's a multiple session class to be able to have conversations about. But just as a quick thing that I know you probably have heard Adam say or us say before, the reality is forgiveness is something that, number one, that God needs to do through you, because we don't always have the capacity in our own to forgive in the way that we want to, especially if it's been something really challenging and painful. But it is a gift to yourself as well. And so when we harbor resentment and we're really struggling with something, we hold on to that. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just snap your fingers and all the pain goes away. It is a long, much longer process. But anyway, so kind of working through that. And again, reiterating what Kay was talking about, this idea that if you are in an unhealthy relationship that where the power differential is not equally yoked and there's abuse, that this is a different kind of way of looking at things. But just in general, being reminded that we're called to forgive as other people forgive us. So now we're going to invite you to have some time to do a little bit of reflection on your own. So you all have a sheet of paper, and that has some writing on it. And on the one side, it says Conflict Styles Worksheet. And we want you to take this out, and we want to invite you, we're going to give you about 7 minutes to kind of work on this. It asks you about your family of origin and how you handled conflict. And then you have some questions that you can answer here. If you'd like to share amongst your table, you're more than welcome to do that. But sometimes we can, for our own personal selves, we're like, I don't really want to talk about my family. And you're totally fine to do that. But if you, at your table, if you want to have some discussions, feel free to do so. Or if after you're finished completing the worksheet, you want to discuss different questions, you can ask the question, answer the questions, is conflict inevitable? And is it always negative? Or can it be negative or positive? What does that look like? So we'll give you 7 minutes to share in conversation, and then we'll bring you back together. Sure. All right.
Okay. So is everybody ready to run from the room away from conflict? Okay, so if you're willing, raise your hand if you avoid conflict. Okay, we have a few. Anybody willing to admit they compete? Okay, so I'm not the only unhealthy person in the room. So, yeah. Listen, trust me, anybody that's been in my class knows, I tell people all the time, I do this because I struggle with the exact same things. I certainly have not perfected it, and my husband and I certainly haven't perfected it in our marriage. So that's absolutely, it's a work in progress for all of us. And Wendy and I, while you guys were talking, we're talking about our kids and how do you teach your kids this? Because none of us had conflict resolution when we were in school. The most you had was you got a timeout, or you got in trouble for being mean to somebody, and maybe you had a conversation, but we never really learned conflict resolution. We didn't sit down and do that. So it's an odd, uncomfortable position for most of us. And, it does take practice. But we'll talk about the sources of conflict, and I think these aren't be-all, end-all list. But it's just over years of doing this kind of work and, being in the court system and seeing what, turns into litigation. These are kind of some of the categories. The biggest one I always see are ambiguous roles and responsibilities. That's not my husband, but that is his role and job in the house. It's one of those that he self-assumed, and I am not correcting him. I'm not about to go in and say, it's been 27 years of you doing the toilets. Do you want me to take that over? I haven't said a word, and he's graciously continuing to do it. There's occasions where I'll think, man, he really hasn't gotten on that, but I'm not about to say anything. But what I see a lot with roles and responsibilities is they're vague, they're undefined, and nobody necessarily knows what they are. And this goes for whether or not you're in the workplace or in the home. And what happens is, when they're undefined, somebody gets resentful and feels like somebody's not carrying their load, somebody's not doing what they should do. And the other thing that happens a lot is they change over time. So if you think about it, if you're in a relationship that's new and you're dating, that's very different as far as your roles and responsibilities than when you get married. Suddenly you're sharing the same space. And when somebody didn't pick up after themselves in their own space, that's okay. That's not your problem, but now you're sharing that same space. And then those responsibilities change again when you have a child. They change when our jobs change. Like suddenly you're traveling for work, and guess what? Well, who's going to mow the yard? Who's going to get the groceries? Who's, any of those things. It happens in the workplace when, for example, we downsize and, there were 5 people doing our job. Now there's 3 of us. Well, if the manager's not good at defining, okay, well, Susie, you're going to do this, Johnny, you're going to do this, then there's going to be conflict because somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, I took on the burden of that. I see it a lot. This is an interesting one. I see this a lot in couples and families that are retiring, because that is a drastic role and responsibility change. Because if you've got one family member that's either been in the home or they've retired earlier, they've got their work pattern figured out. They know what to do. And then suddenly the newly retiring person comes in, they don't empty the dishwasher right. They don't load the dishwasher right. I cannot tell you the number of times I see fights over how the dishwasher is loaded. And it sounds petty, but if it's important to you, it adds up. The other one I see a lot of conflict as an example in the roles and responsibilities are when our kids age up. If we're still parenting our 12-year-old like we parented them as a 5-year-old, guess what? You're going to butt heads. And we as parents have to be willing to say, maybe that's a different relationship. I get lots of conflicts with parents with adult children expecting their college student to call them 3 times a day or come over for dinner 3 times a week. You have to say, is that still their responsibility? Is that still, what needs to be happening? And I'm going to let Wendy talk about the second one.
The assumptions and expectations. So it's often unshared expectations, and I think about in all sorts of different relationships. So just today, one of my coworkers said, hey, I'm going to go pick up a salad. Do you want to get one for me too? And I said, sure, that's fine. And I didn't have enough cash, and I said, I'm so sorry. She said, it's okay, you can get it the next time. I was like, okay, I'll know that. And I'm going to mental note, okay, the next time I buy a salad, I'm going to let her know so I can buy it for her. But that, she clarified, don't worry about it, it's fine, you can pay the next time. But have you ever been in a relationship where you think that it's going to be reciprocal, but it never is. But maybe you didn't explain that. And you thought, well, I paid this time, surely they'll pay the next time. And then you go out and they're like, well, you paid last time. I thought maybe you'd pick it up again this time. I mean, it could be that. It could be really anything. Unless you're willing to say, hey, this is what my hope is, then let that person know. Or if even better, on the front end, I could have said, I don't have any cash. Is that okay? I can pay you back. And she can say, sure, that's no problem. Whatever that looks like. In relationships with my husband, I can remember one of our very first fights. I remember leaving and saying, I just need some space. And I went to the gym, and I was running on the treadmill, and I had this unrealistic expectation that he was going to beckon me back. Like, please come back. Like, I hope you've had enough time away. But he was just giving me the space that I said that I wanted. And so when I walked back into our apartment, I was like, why didn't you call me? And he's like happy and fine, and he's like watching a TV show, and I'm like sweaty and hot and frustrated. I'm like, bah. And he's like, well, why didn't you just tell me? Or better yet, why didn't you just tell me that you were upset and you needed some space away and come back and not have this unrealistic expectation that I was going to try and connect with you or trying to reach out? And so don't make assumptions about what someone might or might not do. The last one, just kind of as you think about perhaps a coworker, it could be that you think, I'm doing somebody a favor and they'll return me the favor. Whether it's, okay, well, I'm going to stay late this Friday because I know they have my coworker has a daughter who has a soccer game, so I'll stay late. And then the next time that needs to happen, I'll just ask them, they'll do it for me. Well, that may not be the case. They may say, well, I can't. And this will get back to the place of, okay, well, if you never talk about it, are you going to hold resentment for that person when you didn't really have clear expectations in the first place? If that makes sense. It's like, okay, how do you share, even before you do something, even before something happens, how can you share what those expectations are so that in the end, you're not letting one another down or frustrating them?
It's kind of funny, as Wendy was talking about those expectations, I was thinking about with kids, and I can't think of the number of times, and I'm sure some of you parents can relate to this, is, my expectation was if I told my son to clean his room, that he'd clean his room. And I'm thinking, I think I defined that pretty clearly, but there'll be numerous times where I'd go in and there's a big pile in the corner and it's covered up with something, and so we had to go through, okay, the expectation is... and run over it again. So I'm sure some of you have those same frustrations with expectations, that sometimes we have to state them over and over again. I should have said at the beginning, if you do have questions that are coming up as we're going through things, there are bowls on either side. They're not magic bowls. I don't know that they're going to generate the answer that you want to hear, but we're going to try at the end to do some Q&A if we have some time left. So there should be some piece of paper in the books that we're handed around. So if you do have some questions, you can put them on there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Core values is the next one that I see happening a lot. This one it can be different for different people. It's certainly, organizations have core values, but so do our relationships. And it can be something like money comes up a lot. And when you talk about core values surrounding money, a lot of times it's, questions of how are we getting the money? What kind of jobs are we going to do? How are we keeping the money? How are we saving it, investing it? How are we spending the money? Those are things that can be core values. Careers, what path are you going to take? It can also be respect. And I see that come up a lot in situations where somebody starts talking about, well, he's just not respecting me, or she's just not respecting me. And a lot of times that comes back to gratitude. You're not including that person in decisions that they think are crucial. You're maybe being too independent when you're operating in a family unit. I still remember one point, I think my husband and I had been married maybe 5 years, and I'm a fairly independent person, and I'd been looking at cars, and I remember I came home one night and he said, can you do me a favor? Can you at least tell me when you're going to buy a car? And I thought, oh my gosh, does he really think I'm going to go buy a car and not tell him about it? But in his mind, it was like, yeah, she's pretty independent. I could see her going out and doing that. So, that's an element of respect and value. It comes up a lot in fights about, how are we going to parent our children? Are they should they work while they're in school? Should they, have jobs starting at 14? Is that a value that we have in our family? Should they do premier sports? Should they do, whatever it happens to be? It depends on what your values are with your given family. How much time should we spend with our in-laws? If your parents and your children have recently married and they live in the Kansas City area and you've had Sunday dinners every time forever, then you may have a core value that that's what's going to happen. Well, your new daughter-in-law and son-in-law may not have those same core values. And guess what? That's going to create some conflict. And so we can't assume that the values that we have are going to be accepted by everyone else.
Very good. The next one we'll move on to is emotions. And just kind of I think maybe it's something we all recognize and know, but if we are emotionally, if there's something going on in our life emotionally, we don't have quite the same capacity to be able to deal with conflict maybe in a productive way. So this kind of looks like if I've just experienced something really tragic and I'm struggling, I'm really sad, I may be quicker to lash out at somebody, not because of what it is that they did, but because of what it is that I'm experiencing and feeling on the inside. If mental health is something that's a challenge for you, whether it's depression or anxiety or other things that you're working through and processing through, your emotional state will affect how it is that you respond to things. And even just kind of being aware of that, and we'll talk a little bit more about best practices, that just because I'm sad or I'm stressed at work doesn't give me the excuse and the ability to mistreat someone else, but that just sometimes kind of helps us to think through that and processing through that. And then just the last one I would say with regard to emotions is if there's somebody that we don't necessarily trust, that's going to affect how we're going to have conflict with them and whether or not we're willing to approach them and have conversations with them. Or, if we feel like, okay, we're at an even-keeled kind of place, we can have open and honest discussions, knowing those sorts of things. So just being aware of it helps us to manage and know I'll talk about this in a minute too, but if I'm angry, in general, I may not have the best response. So kind of giving myself a moment to kind of pull back. So our son is 4, so sometimes my references are children's TV shows. So Daniel Tiger, who is a spinoff of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, has this little song and says, "When you feel so mad that you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4." And but it's like it works, except that I tell my son that I don't want to breathe. I don't want to count to 4. And so then he proceeds to move off into some, continue his tantrum. If you have young children or you've had them, you get it. So, but I can't reason with him when he's in the midst of chaotic tantrum. That is not a moment of reason. I have to let that emotion go and then come back. Which is where kind of when we talked about the scriptural idea of, okay, when our tensions are high, when our emotions are high, but when we give ourselves patience and are able to come back, sometimes that's the best way that we have to deal with and work through conflict.
It's kind of interesting in dealing in family law. I cannot tell you the number of times people come in and they're obviously in high conflict or they wouldn't be coming to talk to me. And the first thing they'll always say, and it's like WebMD, they'll be like, "Well, we're dealing with a narcissist. I Googled it." And I'm like, well, maybe they're just a really difficult person, considering only about 4% of the population fall into that category. But okay, maybe, but we'll figure it out. So we're all really good at diagnosing somebody else and their emotion, or their emotional shortcomings. But one thing I'd encourage you to do is, take a look at yourself too and just say, okay, is that something that I'm overreacting to? Is that something that I'm overly emotional about? And so I think sometimes turning that look back at ourselves is missing sometimes in the conflict. The next one we talk about is filters and perceptions. And if you've been at Resurrection very long, I think Adam's done this sermon a couple of times where he does the backpack with the rocks, and he talks about all the stuff that we're carrying around. And man, we're all carrying it. I mean, there's something that we've all had from childhood or adulthood. And what happens is we each have our own narrative, and we each have our own stories that we tell each other. And what psychologists have taught us over time is that those stories change a little bit depending on who we're telling them to, or the time frame that we're telling them to, and the number of times that we repeat them. But they become our truth. And the other person that you're in conflict does the exact same thing. And what I usually see in mediation is, yes, that's Wendy's truth, and that's my truth, but the real facts and the real truth are somewhere between those two. You know, there's some element of truth in each one of our stories and our narratives. But the problem is, when we bring those experiences and perceptions and filters from our old relationships, we overlay them on the ones that we have now. So as an example, how that plays out, Scott did a great sermon last week on infidelity. And what happens oftentimes, if you've had that such that your trust was broken in a prior relationship, and something happens in your current relationship and your significant other is coming home later or has had different job changes, you know, all of a sudden that tape starts spinning in your head and you start accusing that person of things that have happened to you in the past. If you've had a toxic work environment where you've had a manager that was just awful, and then you're in a new environment and something happens, it'll trigger that response in you, and you just have to be really careful about that. And I think along with the emotional one, like Wendy was talking about, those are really good therapeutic issues to talk to someone about and just say, hey, you know, here's what I'm seeing, and it's coming up over and over again, because you can infiltrate every other relationship you have by issues that have happened over here, and just be aware that both of you have them in any kind of conflict.
All right, others. This is the sort of like catch-all. So I'm going to throw in several things here. So some of what we think about is the way in which other people may cause us to have conflict. So this, if you think about your work environment or friends, this could be gossip that's taking place, or even you think about people kind of taking sides, like whether or not you realize that they're trying to do it or you're trying to do it, sort of like garnering support of like, can you believe this person? You're like having conversations, and sort of it kind of feels like you go back to the middle school kind of thing of like, I want this person to be on my side to hear my particular story, and kind of thinking and processing through all of that. You could, one of the other, and kind of the avoiding tactic could be that that a particular person, maybe in your workplace or a friend group, is the martyr. They're always doing the thing that nobody else wants to do, but nobody's always, maybe sometimes people have asked them, but maybe not. And then they're sort of causing conflict because they're frustrated that they're the ones always cleaning up at the end of dinner, or they're the ones always doing this or doing that. And they're doing it, maybe they want to be acknowledged, but they haven't given the assumption or something like that. But they're kind of causing sort of internal drama. You know, maybe, or we are causing internal drama, blaming or sort of setting what they would call turf wars of like, this is, like setting up turf again. And so it's the sense of just kind of, in some ways, how we respond in general can, and how other people process through things can cause conflict just happening. The last sort of little acronym that I'll share, I just wanted to toss it in there, is this is something I think about with my own son, but there's an acronym called HALT, and it is when you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So for me, the hungry and the tired are sometimes the most important ones to think about. If you are hungry, I would say, I'm not my best self. And when I am sleep deprived, I am definitely not the best person that I want to be. If I'm angry or lonely, so that kind of acronym of what's going on in my own emotional and physical state that may be affecting how I'm going to adequately and helpfully, process through conflict.
So this one's a challenge for me, because I see it happening so much. And vague language, it usually comes out in, and tell me if you do this, you're angry about something, but the other person says, what's wrong? You seem to be upset. And I'm like, no, I'm fine. And my voice gets that elevated, higher pitch, which anybody can tell you is the ultimate signal for I am not fine at all. And so we all have those sort of things. And kind of like Wendy said, I mean, I call it when you kick into middle school mode. It's when, if you start getting the passive aggressive thing where, you're just almost baiting the other person and just going, that's okay, I'll do it, that's okay, I'll do it. And then in your mind, you're just thinking, I'm so going to get back at them for doing that, And sometimes in the workplace that happens in sabotage, where they'll sabotage somebody else's work and then do an intentional slowdown, just to have something bad happen for you. I see it, with button pushing. Let's face it, if you're in a relationship for more than 3 weeks, you can pretty well figure out what somebody's buttons are. And man, when we are in conflict and we're angry, boy, I sound really unhealthy, don't I? Not that I do any of these things. But when I do, I do try to catch myself because I know what's gonna push my husband's buttons. We have an ongoing, unresolved, I don't know if you'd call it conflict, but it kind of is in our house. My husband's a little bit OCD. And so he gets the mail every day. He also pays the bills. So if a bill or something comes in, and it's both of our bills, he'll put it on the island. Okay, I ignore it. So guess what he does? He moves it to my dinner plate. Guess what I do? I move it back to the island. So a given bill in our house can traverse that territory 5 or 6 times before somebody opens it and actually pays it. How stupid is that? We've been married 27 years, and we still do it. But, that's just, obviously I tell you all the things that I do wrong too. Guilt is one that we do as parents, particularly with our adult children. And it usually comes out in, well, if you're going to go to her house, I guess we just won't put up a tree this year. Hopefully your dad will be around next year for Thanksgiving. Don't do that. Don't do that. The other one is the martyr mode, and we all have those friends, kind of like Wendy said, that play the martyr. That's not one that happens to work with me, but, if you do that, try to catch yourself. I mean, we can all get better at it. We all do some of these things some of the time, but the goal is to do them less and less. And clearly, I haven't progressed from 27 years of moving the bills around in the house, but, it's a work in progress, so.
All right, so having kind of walked through, I listed the sources of conflict because there's a sheet that we want you to discuss and have conversations about, and you may need to refer back to this. So on the flip side of the handout that you received, it says conflict scenarios. And because conflict can rise up within us and bring some emotional things, we wanted to give you some things that you all as a table could decide you wanted to talk about. So there are 3 different categories, and you can choose 1 or 2, or you can just kind of pick which ones you want to have a conversation about, but talk through them, and then so talk about them. What's the primary source of conflict? And so the sources of conflict are listed there. And then what are each person's needs? So think about, we'll talk more about this a little later about why it's important to understand what one another's needs are. But we are going to give you 15 minutes to share in conversation. So go through as many of these as you can. If you want, it might be helpful to touch on one from each category. Or if you really feel like your table says, I really want to work on family and friends, you can spend the majority of your time there, whatever that looks like. But have some conversation, talk about them. You hear the sources of conflict are up here, and we'll give you 15 minutes.
And if you do have questions that you're thinking of in the meantime,
Yes.
and you want to drop them in the bowls, go ahead and you can do that too.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we're going to bring you guys back together.
Really
I'm glad to see everybody's having good discussion. Hopefully nobody's talking about anyone that's not here and using their name if your significant other isn't here. Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about, one of the questions we did get was, what was the book Wendy mentioned? It's called Conflict Without Casualties, and the author is Rieger, R-E-G-I-E-R. So
and I'll have it up here if you want to take a look at it, too.
So we're going to talk about the process. And one of the things I would encourage you, and Wendy and I were talking about, and I mentioned earlier, that we're not good at teaching our kids as they're coming up and how to do conflict. And so if you've got kids or grandkids, it's okay to let them see you have dialogues. You don't want to have screaming matches, but if you have them see you do, some of these processes on things that would be appropriate for them, it's a good exercise. So think about that, because you really do need to help your kids understand that and your grandkids. So when we talk about best practices, the first one, set ground rules. I mean, it sounds childlike, but the biggest, most important one here is set a time frame. Let each person talk, say 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes at the most. And the rule is you're not going to interrupt. You're not going to say, oh, but, any of those. You're just going to sit there. My way of doing that is I'll take notes while they're talking. Now, if you're furiously taking notes like I'm going to get you notes, that's not right. What you're taking notes on is trying to listen to understand what they're saying. Because I think most of the time what we do when we're in conflict mode is we're asking follow-up questions to interrogate. And what you want to do is ask questions to try to understand where that person is coming from. And most importantly, the agreement is we're not going to attack each other. But the other thing is we're not going to talk to anybody else about this. You're not going to go to work. You're not going to call your mom, your girlfriends, your buddies and say, okay, we're in this fight. We're talking about this. You're going to talk to the person that you've got the conflict with.
Okay.
I guess I'm doing the next section.
Yes.
Sorry. Obviously, this tag team thing we haven't quite got figured out. So identify the issues. And there's a couple of slides here. We talked earlier about position is what somebody says at the very beginning. Like, you spent too much money last weekend. I'll use money as an example because that comes up a lot. But what you're looking for is what the interests are. So if you'll flip to the next slide, you're trying to figure out, what do you both really need here? What is it you want? Somebody may say as a position, you spent too much money this weekend, but what may be behind that is fear. What may be behind that is, I don't feel respected because you made a significant purchase, you didn't even talk to me about it. It may be that that person is having some problems at work and you don't even know about that, and they're worried about, am I going to get laid off? Am I going to lose my job? Are we going to be able to pay for other things? So when you spent money, that triggered a response in them. And so you're trying to figure out, what's everybody really need? What I really want? And you're trying to look for the opportunities within that. And we'll talk a little bit about those. But, as you're going through the process and you're trying to listen and hear what the issues are from the person, feel yourself for defensiveness and blame, because a lot of times I'll hear people get caught in this if-then cycle where they say, well, if you did this, then I could do this. Or if you didn't do this, I wouldn't have done that. And that blame cycle and defensiveness, it doesn't allow you to get any further. But when you're identifying the issues, it's really important to put a priority on them. If you have every single issue at a 10, I can promise you it's not, first off. But what happens is the cry wolf thing kicks in. So if the person you're in conflict with, everything you think is a 10, and they're like, yeah, that's so a 1, you're going to lose credence. You're going to lose the ability to actually talk about something that is important. But I think it is important for both of you to say, yeah, I think that's a 1. That's really not that big of an issue. Not minimizing what the other person says, but at least accounting for that both of you may have a different feeling for how important this is.
Great. The next one we're going to talk about is validating the issues and feelings. And what I would say, if you had to boil it down, it would be to say, I may not necessarily agree that you feel a particular way, but I validate that that is your experience, okay? So as you think and process through this, what you are doing is you are saying, your experience is your experience, my experience is my experience. I'll go back to something Kay said before, and she talked about stories. We all have stories, we all have prior experiences, and what I feel, maybe I said something to you that I didn't think was offensive, but to you it was. And if I say, well, that wasn't offensive, I've just told them, you don't matter. Your feelings don't matter. What you think and feel does not matter. And I've automatically put up a wall where they say, well, I don't matter, okay? And instead, if you're able to say, you matter, I'm listening, I'm validating what your experience is, and that may not mean like that you agree with it, you may not like their choices, doesn't mean all those things, but you acknowledge what that means. And I often find myself being able to say, okay, thank you for sharing this with me. So validating it is listening well, acknowledging them, apologizing when it's appropriate, and being able to clearly say, whatever it was, your experience, that was not my intent. And being able to apologize and say you're sorry for the thing that that caused them to feel that way. And ultimately to take responsibility, okay? And we'll talk more, I'll kind of finish that time off in just a moment about, okay, what kind of responsibility do I have moving forward as we talk about maybe taking a plan of changes and things that we want to institute.
The next one is, this is a great one when you're trying to teach kids how to do it, and that is brainstorming solutions. And we do this a lot in the workplace with brainstorm, but a lot of times it's not done right. It should be a very small period of time, like 5 minutes. And when you're doing brainstorming, the idea is it's a non-judgment zone. Nobody says, we've tried that, that won't work, that's stupid, no comments like that. So, at work, if it's like multiple people, you can have somebody writing the comments as people throw them out there. This includes, for any of you like me who eye roll, no eye rolls when somebody comes up with ideas. I like the Post-it note picture because I've seen it worked really well in families because you can write things really quickly and throw them up there. Then what you do is you go back and you categorize them, like we were talking about spending a minute ago. Then you can put them into categories like, okay, saving, how are we earning the money, how are we spending the money, and that way you can kind of hone in on what the issues are. These are great ones to work with your kids or your grandkids on. When a kid says, I don't want to do this, I want to do that, well, you can sit there and say, okay, let's brainstorm some solutions for that. Now, ultimately, it may still end up being what you have, but it lets them express their feelings. Our son, growing up in a house with 2 lawyers, decided that he was going to take debate in high school because then he could beat us. Well, it is a good theory, and we actually, as a child, made him, if he wanted to do something that was out of the ordinary, he had to come with 3 persuasive reasons why he thought that was a good idea. And I'm sure it was frustrating for him because ultimately I have veto power, as does my husband. So there were lots of times where I'm like, that is great logic. You've really thought this through. No. But, that's also part of life, is learning to deal with the no's. But it's a great teaching opportunity for your kids to kind of come about and say, okay, here's why I want to do things that way.
Okay. All right, so the next one is planning. So develop a plan. So I'm a planner. So I sometimes say this quote, Benjamin Franklin, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail, okay? And not only making a plan, but an important part of a plan is also saying, when are we going to follow up? So that will be like the last, coming back to this. So when we talked about if you have someone who's likely to avoid, what is my plan to have what am I going to do? How am I going to work through? What are my goals? Okay? And thinking about what are each areas. The second is areas for improvement. So what pieces, what parts do we really need to work on? That kind of gets back to the underlying issue. So it's not just about spending money. It's not just about this decision you made. Is there something much deeper that we really need to think about and process through? Next steps by each person, because we all have something to play. Each and every one of us has a part to play in the conflict, and what am I going to do that is going to make a difference? And importantly, I think we want to think about what are our strengths. So as we're making up next steps of what we're going to do, how can we do things that we feel like, okay, I'm really good at that thing. I'm going to process through that, and this is what I feel comfortable. Now, it doesn't mean you don't get pushed outside of your comfort zone, but trying to kind of walk in through those things. Setting a time frame. Then the last 2 are really evaluating success and coming back and modifying. This is one that we often forget to do because we're like, well, we talked about that thing, we made a decision, we're going to do this, but it's not always as good as it could be. So being able to say, okay, let's talk about this in a week. How is it going? Is it actually working? Or do you need to modify it and change it? And even if it's slightly different, it could make it that much better. But if it's not going well, then what do you need to do to make a change, to make a transformation for you to know that it can be the best that it possibly can be? The last thing, as I think about this too, is setting really good, clear boundaries. And I'm not always great at setting boundaries, but boundaries can really help you say this. It's a healthy thing. It's saying, okay, this is what I'm willing to do or what I'm not willing to do. So as you are talking about what you're going to do, how you're going to process through the challenge or the conflict, whatever it is, if you say, this is outside of what I'm willing to do, being able to say, no, I set that clearly defined, and someone is not going to say, I'm going to do more than I really feel comfortable doing. So making sure that that's a process and a possibility, and that you hold one another accountable and yourself accountable. If I need to take responsibility for doing something that I shouldn't, you know what I mean? Like, I said that I was going to do this thing and I didn't, and I'm accepting responsibility. If you can name that before the other person has to, that's a win. So just kind of as an awareness of saying, I said I was going to do that thing, I didn't, I'm sorry, I will do it, and being able to be clear about what that looks like. So the last passage of scripture we have is encourage each other and build each other up as you are already doing. Ultimately, what we hope will happen is as you are having intentional and sometimes really hard and challenging conversations, you will grow in relationship with one another. If you don't have healthy conflict, if you're yelling and screaming at one another and are not able to process through things, there's going to be hurt and resentment. If you don't talk about things and never really kind of work through them, you're not going to be as close as you have the ability to be. But if instead you say, I'm seeking to encourage you, to be compassionate with you, and you're seeking to do the same, that you'll have an opportunity to really kind of grow and lean in together. So we had time for Q&A, but we haven't had any questions. So I don't know if there are any brave souls who have a question that they want to ask.
I want to piggyback too on what Wendy just said. You know, when she's talking about making your relationship better, first off, give you guys your own congratulations tonight. You're sitting in a relationship class at the end of a day. You're exhausted. Now, some of you may have been brought here against your will, but, you know, hopefully you heard a few things while you're here. And when she was talking about, you know, working on the relationship, I think it made me think about, and you were just talking about, you know, people buying new houses and things like that. And I don't know about you guys, but there's lots of times where when I'm getting ready to move and I fix the house up so it can sell better, and then I'm like, why did I live in it for 10 years and not do all those things so I could enjoy it? Or your car, and you get it all clean and you take it to trade in, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, this was stupid. I could have had a better car for the last 3 years. Think about it, your relationship, and I'm not minimizing your relationship and comparing it to a car, but think about it. I mean, you may have a good relationship and it may be okay. Hopefully it's better than okay. But think how much better it could be, and you're starting that by just coming tonight and to come, you know, to all the series of you know, relationship things. So bravo to you guys for being here.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yay. Well, so we're going to get you out 2 minutes early, but we're going to share just a couple things. I mentioned a counseling referral. If there are some things that any sort of relationship with your child, with a loved one, with whomever, or personally that you're trying to process through, we would be happy to help you get connected with a therapist. We even offer scholarships if finances are a challenge. So fill out this link, and you can share a little bit more about what it is you're looking for in a therapist, and that is a really great and healthy thing. And both Kay and I say, if you can talk to somebody before it gets really bad, that's much, much better. So get help before it gets explosive or really feels like it's outside of the reach of being able to make things good.
See Wendy so you don't have to come see me.
Yeah. Next week, we're going to be talking about intimacy. And so James Cochran, who joined me last week, is going to have a sex therapist with him. And we're not just going to be talking about sex, we're going to talk about intimacy in all relationships. So I think it'll be a really encouraging and insightful conversation. So hope you'll come back and join us. And if you have somebody who would like to join, you can do that. Let us pray. God, we give you thanks for the gift that it is to share in conversation, to have difficult conversations, but knowing that you call us to have lives that are enriched by honesty and openness and transformation. Send us forth today with the hope that we can do that. All this we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
We'll see you on Sunday.